They say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when your family is a twisted web of darkness? Join us as we explore the top 10 evil families who committed crimes so chilling they'll make your skin crawl. Starting off this list, we are talking about the Lafferty brothers. Ron and Dan were not just your typical criminals. Part of a radical polygamist group that broke away from the mainstream Mormon church, these brothers turned their religious beliefs into a nightmare. In 1984, they shockingly claimed that God had told them to commit horrifying crimes. Their victims? Couple members of their own family. The brutality of the crimes involving a weapon and a very personal attack absolutely rocked the nation, especially because the brothers showed no remorse, believing that they were carrying out a divine command. This very chilling story is a stark reminder of how dangerously twisted the path of fanaticism can definitely become. Next, we are talking about the Ripper Crew, often remembered as one of Chicago's most horrifying gangs in the early 1980s. This was not just an average group of criminals. They were led by the disturbingly charismatic Robin Gecht. This quartet of men transformed their twisted fantasies into a very gruesome reality. Their crimes weren't just shocking for the sheer brutality of them, they involved some horrific details that ended in the deaths of at least 18 women. But of course, it didn't stop there. The Ripper Crew elevated their wickedness to another level with human consumption and very bizarre ritualistic practices, including amputations performed to satisfy Gecht's grotesque obsessions. Their rituals, believed to involve eating parts of their victims as a way to gain power, still send shivers down the spine of those who remember the case. Just horrific. There's really no other word for it other than just absolutely horrific. Next up, we are talking about the Papin sisters. The Papin sisters, Christine and Leah, were the centerpiece of one of France's most chilling cases. Back in 1933, these two seemingly quiet live-in maids snapped in a spectacularly horrific way. They brutally took the life of their employer's wife and daughter in France. The details were gruesome. The victims' eyes were gouged out, and the attacks were so violent that even the police couldn't believe what they were seeing. This wasn't just a simple crime of rage. The sisters worked in tandem, methodically carrying out the crimes in a way that left the nation reeling. What makes the sisters' story so captivating is how it peeled back the veneer of domestic tranquility to expose a deep, dark vein of class tension and psychological turmoil. These sisters weren't just maids, they were symbols of the oppressed working class, pushed to the brink by their subservient roles and eventually breaking in the most dramatic way possible. I'm definitely not victim blaming at all. It just is definitely one of those cases where there's just a lot going on. The backstory is pretty wild. Their trial was of course a media sensation, stirring up debates about mental health, workers' rights, and the hidden despair lurking in ordinary lives. In the end, the sisters' saga is a macabre tale of what happens when the human mind is pushed too far, wrapped in a mystery that still fascinates and horrifies people to this day. And I'm sure for as long as we remember the story, it will always be absolutely horrifying. Next, we are talking about the Briley brothers, Linwood, James, and Anthony, who all turned 1979 Richmond, Virginia into their personal hunting ground in a chilling spree that lasted over 7 months. These brothers weren't picky, they engaged in random acts of violence, home invasions, and cold-blooded crimes, racking up at least 11 victims. Their reign of terror included not just killing, but also tormenting their victims and stealing anything that they could get their hands on. Just imagine the fear that gripped Richmond as these brothers moved from one crime to the next, seemingly always one step ahead of the law. The manhunt to catch them was one of Virginia's most intense and nerve-wracking, with the whole community holding its breath until they were thankfully finally brought to justice. Next, we're talking about the Bloody Benders, who were like the horror movie family you hope to never meet. Operating in Kansas during the 1870s, they ran a seemingly innocent inn and general store, but with a very grisly twist. The family, led by the very mysterious John Bender and his equally mysterious kin, had a very chilling side hustle, killing their guests for cash. Travelers would check in and well, they wouldn't really check out. The Benders cleverly positioned their victims at a seat of honor at their dinner table, which was unfortunately placed over a trapdoor. I'm not laughing, that's just crazy that that's real. I feel like that's only in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but nope, very real. After a hearty meal, the guest would be whacked on the head and then dropped into the cellar to meet a very grim fate. This went on until the neighborhood started noticing that people who visited the Benders tended to disappear into thin air. Honest to God, thank you for the nosy neighbor in that situation. Alright, sometimes a nosy neighbor can be annoying, but I guess when the Benders are in town, we need them. When the suspicions grew too intense, the Benders did what any family of criminal masterminds would do. They vanished. By the time the locals pieced everything together and dug up the property, the Benders were long gone, leaving behind a legacy that turned their homestead into an infamous chapter of Wild West lore. Yeah, they just vanished. No justice in that story. Next we are talking about Behram and the Thuggee cult. The story of Behram and the cult are like something straight out of a horror classic, but this nightmare was very real in 19th century India. Behram, who was the cult's most infamous leader, is often called one of history's worst killers. So basically, the whole thing was a secretive gang called the Thuggees, and they roamed the Indian countryside with a very chilling mission. Their MO was to befriend travelers, take their lives with a ceremonial scarf called a rumal, and then rob them blind. They did this all under the guise of worshipping the goddess Kali, believing their crimes were a form of devotion. The leader himself is said to have been directly involved in taking the lives of over 900 people. The British eventually cracked down on this crime group, but the sheer scale of their crimes and the cold-bloodedness of the leaders like Behram still boggle the mind even today. Next we're talking about the Carrington family, also sometimes known as the Fall River cult. In the late 1970s, the quiet town of Fall River, Massachusetts became the backdrop for a horrifying series of events. Carl Drew and Robin Murphy, two seemingly ordinary individuals, actually led a satanic cult that included members of the Carrington family. This dark and twisted group was involved in the brutal, ritualistic killings of 3 women, shocking everyone with the level of violence and the satanic practices involved. The crimes were not just gruesome, they were carried out with a ceremonial cruelty that suggested that they were more than mere killings. They were actually rituals meant to honor some nefarious unseen force. As the cult continued their sinister activities, the local community lived in fear, and the mysterious aura surrounding the Carrington family grew. Details emerged of rituals, sacrifices, and an unsettling belief in dark powers, painting a picture of a family caught in the grip of something truly evil. This saga of brutality, mysticism, and mayhem left an indelible mark on Fall River, turning the Carrington family into a name synonymous with one of the most disturbing chapters in the town's history. Next we are talking about the Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, and they were not just gangsters, they were celebrities of the criminal underworld in the East End of London during the swinging 50s and 60s. These twins ran their gang called The Firm, with a mix of brutal violence and a surprising dash of charm, pulling off armed robberies, running protection rackets, and setting the occasional building on fire when needed. But the Krays weren't just about the tough stuff. They rubbed elbows with politicians and pop stars, making them the feared yet fascinating faces of London's mob scene. Their story is an absolute wild ride, complete with evil crimes, glamorous parties, and a dramatic downfall that turned them into legends. Everyone knew that crossing the Krays was a one-way ticket to trouble, but it is said that their charisma made them oddly magnetic figures in London's tumultuous underbelly. Next we are talking about the Bourgeois family. This family is like the original Game of Thrones cast, full of plots, poison, and power grabs. During the Renaissance, they were like the Kardashians of their day, but way more dangerous. Rodrigo Bourgeois, who wormed his way into becoming Pope Alexander VI, was the family's superstar. Under his rule, the Vatican was less about piety and more about power plays and partying. His son Caesar was the real-life version of Machiavelli's prince, ruthless, cunning, and a master manipulator who inspired fear and respect. And then there's Lucretia, often painted as the femme fatale of the family, wrapped up in rumors of poison rings and scandalous affairs, but also a savvy political figure in her own right. Together, they turned the church and European politics into their personal chess game, leaving a trail of intrigue, mysterious deaths, and whispered secrets that make them one of history's most notorious and fascinating families. And finally, to close out our list today, we are talking about the Sawney Bean family. You would think that a family called the Beans would be like cute and nice and wholesome, like we're the Beans. But no, of course not. It simply just has to be the stuff of nightmares. The chilling saga of the Sawney Bean family is a tale that definitely straddles the murky line between Scottish folklore and nightmarish reality. So let's take it back to the 16th century on the rugged Scottish coastlines, where a secretive clan led by the infamous Sawney Bean resides. According to legend, this family wasn't your typical band of misfits, they were human eaters. Hiding out in a secluded coastal cave, the Bean clan supposedly ambushed unsuspecting travelers at night, dragging them back to their grim abode to meet a gruesome end. The stories claim that they took the lives of and feasted on over 1,000 people, thriving in secrecy for decades. Historians, however, are a little skeptical. I'm not here to lie to you. They poke holes in the tale, questioning its authenticity and suggesting it might be more about sensationalism than historical fact. But whether myth or fact, the story of the Bean family has fascinated and horrified people for generations, making it a perfect blend of horror and historical mystery. So, was Sawney Bean a real figure of terror, or just a boogeyman born from the depths of folklore? The answer might depend on how dark you like your history served. We're back with part 2 of the most chilling, spine-tingling countdown you'll ever see. The top 10 families whose depravity will make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. Starting off today, we are talking about the Harpe brothers. Micah Big Harpe and Wiley Little Harpe were notorious outlaws who roamed the American frontier in the late 18th century, earning the grim title of America's first documented serial killers. These brothers were a brutal duo who left a bloody trail across Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, claiming the lives of at least 39 people. Their crimes weren't just about the body count, they took a very dark pleasure in the cruelty of their methods, often harming their victims in ways that sent shockwaves of horror through the communities they terrorized. Beyond their savage crimes, the Harpes were also known for their thievery and for setting fires to cover their tracks or create diversions. Their reign of terror came to a gruesome end when they were finally captured, but their tales of brutality lived on, painting them as a sort of boogeyman of the early American wilderness. Next, we are talking about the Gonzalez sisters. Delfina and Maria were infamous figures in Mexico during the 1950s and 1960s, not just for running a large sex work ring, but for the terrifying manner in which they managed their illicit business. These sisters turned their ranch into a nightmarish hub of criminal activity where they lured countless young women with promises of legitimate jobs, only to force them into a life of darkness and crime. The depths of their cruelty didn't stop there. The sisters were notoriously brutal, punishing and sometimes killing the women over minor infractions or when they became too ill or too old to work. They also didn't hesitate to eliminate any clients who crossed them or knew too much, but by the time the authorities caught up with them, it was revealed that their reign of terror resulted in the deaths of at least 91 people. Next, we are moving on to the Shelton Brothers gang. Led by the notorious trio of Carl, Earl, and Bernie Shelton, they were a force to be reckoned with in southern Illinois during the Prohibition era. These brothers turned bootlegging into an art form, running illegal alcohol with a mix of charm and brute force. They didn't just stop at smuggling hooch, they expanded their empire into gambling and weren't shy about knocking out the competition, literally. Their battles with rival gangs were like the stuff of legend, featuring high-octane shootouts and dramatic bombings, but the Sheltons were also very savvy political operators. They knew that a little influence could go a long way, so they cozied up to local politicians to shield their operations from the law. Whether it was bribing officials or intimidating enemies, they had a hand in shaping the political landscape to suit their needs. Their blend of criminal cunning and entrepreneurial spirit made them a powerhouse during one of America's most tumultuous times, and their legacy is a wild chapter in the history of the American Midwest's underworld. Next, we are talking about the DeMeo crew, an infamous arm of the Gambino Mafia family. They were the epitome of ruthless efficiency in New York City's underworld during the 1970s and the 1980s. Led by the notorious Roy DeMeo, this gang was feared for their brutal tactics and cold-blooded efficiency. They weren't just your average mobsters. These guys turned crime into a gruesome art form, specializing in a method they dubbed the Gemini method, which involved taking the lives of their victims, then systematically dismembering them to dispose of the bodies more effectively. Unsettling. It's believed they were responsible for up to 100 of these gruesome crimes, leaving a trail of terror across the city. Their operations weren't limited to eliminating rivals or unfortunate snitches. They dipped their bloody hands into various mafia enterprises, from car theft rings known as the car theft capital of the world to substance trafficking and loan sharking. Next, we are talking about the Sackler family, owners of Purdue Pharma. They are often seen as the face of the opioid crisis that has ravaged communities across the United States. They made their fortune from OxyContin, a powerful painkiller that became a blockbuster drug thanks to aggressive marketing and sales tactics. Despite its effectiveness for pain relief, OxyContin also became infamous for its addictive qualities, a fact that many accuse the Sacklers of deliberately downplaying to boost sales. As the death toll from opioid overdoses soared into the hundreds of thousands, the family found themselves in hot water, facing a barrage of lawsuits from states, cities, and individuals claiming Purdue Pharma's practices contributed significantly to the epidemic. The Sacklers saga is a very complex mix of medical innovation, corporate greed, and a public health disaster, leaving a legacy mired in controversy and a nation grappling with the consequences of addiction. Next, we are talking about the Duvalier family, led first by Francois Papadoc and then led by his son Jean-Claude Baby Doc. They dominated Haiti from 1957 to 1986, and their reign was nothing short of a horror movie come to life. Papadoc, a former doctor turned dictator, used his private militia, the Tonton Macoute, as a tool of terror. These guys were aptly named after a boogeyman from Haitian folklore, but their horror was unfortunately very real. They enforced Papadoc's rule through torment, kidnappings, and the disappearance of anyone who whispered a word of dissent. When Papadoc passed away, his son Baby Doc took over and the nightmare continued. Under their rule, Haiti was stripped of its wealth, with the Duvaliers living large while the country plunged into poverty and chaos. Their legacy? A lasting shadow of fear and corruption that still darkens Haitian politics. It's a stark reminder of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, leaving a nation to collect the pieces long after they were gone. Next, we are talking about the Rajneesh family, or the followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who later rebranded himself as Osho. They were more like a tight-knit cult than a traditional family. In the early 1980s, this group set up a commune called Rajneesh Puram in the wilds of Oregon, creating a mini-city complete with its own airport, malls, and police force. Their goal? To live out the spiritual leader's vision of a utopian society. However, of course, things took a dark turn when they attempted to take over the local government in Wasco County. Under the directive of Ma Anand Sheela, Osho's fiery personal secretary, the Rajneeshis hatched a plan to win a county election by incapacitating the local voter base. In a shocking move, they spread salmonella bacteria on salad bars in 10 local restaurants, sickening over 750 people in one of the largest bioterror attacks in US history. But their scheming didn't stop at biological warfare. I guess that just wasn't enough. They were also caught engaging in a slew of other illegal activities, including immigration fraud, wiretapping, and even plotting assassinations to silence their critics. Next, we are talking about the Moran family. They were central figures in the gritty and blood-soaked drama of Melbourne's Gangland Wars, a series of brutal conflicts that rocked Australia's underworld in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Led by the tough-as-nails patriarch Louis Moran and his sons Mark and Jason, this family was deeply entrenched in the drug trade, living a life that mixed the glamour of big money with the grim reality of urban warfare. Their world was one where loyalty was under constant test and where any moment could erupt into violence, often leading to gruesome crimes as a tool for solving disputes and silencing rivals. The Moran saga of crime and retribution didn't just make headlines, it actually inspired the hit TV series Underbelly, which really pulled back the curtain on their lives with a mix of true events and also a little dramatic flair. This show gave viewers a front row seat to the high stakes and fatal twists of Melbourne's criminal depths, portraying the Morans not just as cold-hearted gangsters, but as complex characters navigating a deadly game. Their story is a chilling reminder of how deeply crime can run in a family and how it can spiral out into a community, leaving a legacy of fear and fascination in its wake. Next, we are talking about the Gucci family. While not criminally evil in like the traditional sense, like maybe some of the others we've spoken about today, the Gucci family's saga reads like a script from a dramatic, high-fashion thriller complete with betrayal, opulence, and a dash of cold-blooded crime. This illustrious Italian family, known worldwide for their luxury fashion brand, has found themselves in the headlines for far more sinister reasons. Maurizio Gucci, the charming but embattled grandson of the founder Guccio Gucci, met a tragic end in 1995 when he was gunned down in Milan. The mastermind behind his killing was none other than his glamorous ex-wife, Patrizia Reggiani, who was dubbed the Black Widow by the press. She hired a hitman to kill Maurizio after their divorce, reportedly unhappy with his handling of the family fortune and his plans to marry another woman. This shocking act was the culmination of years of family infighting and luxury living gone awry, where the quest for control and the Gucci empire led to a series of disputes, legal battles, and financial missteps. As the Gucci family's dirty laundry aired in public, the world watched a real-life drama that overshadowed the brand's glossy image, showing that even in the world of high fashion, the price of greed and heartbreak can definitely be deadly. And finally on our list today, we are talking about the House of Habsburg. This was like the ultimate European royal powerhouse, ruling over the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and Austria for hundreds of years. They were super influential, but they had a very strange way of keeping power within the family. They just married their own cousins. Lots of intermarriage to keep the dynasty pure, but this led to some very serious problems. The most notorious was the Habsburg jaw, a jutting jawline that was so pronounced in some family members that they had trouble speaking and eating. The most extreme case was Charles II of Spain, a guy whose health and mental abilities were so affected by these genetic issues that his reign is often cited as a major factor in the decline of the Spanish Empire. He was known as the Bewitched because of his various ailments and how they affected his rule. The poor guy's health was a total mess, and since he couldn't produce an heir, his death marked the end of the Habsburg line in Spain. This whole entire saga shows how the Habsburgs' obsession with keeping it in the family led to their downfall, turning them into a textbook example of why genetic diversity matters, especially if you're running an empire. Starting off our list today, we are talking about the House of Plantagenet. This was like a real-life version of Game of Thrones, ruling over England from the mid-12th to the late 15th centuries. These guys were at the center of the Wars of the Roses, a messy, bloody series of civil wars that were basically one giant family feud over who got to wear the crown. The family split into two main factions, the Yorks and the Lancasters. Think of them as the ultimate sibling rivalry, but instead of fighting over who gets the remote, they battled it out for the English throne. This internal family drama wasn't just a couple of minor skirmishes, it was a full-on warfare that threw England into chaos for decades. Castles were besieged, armies marched across the country, and battles left fields soaked in blood. Kings were made and unmade in battles like those at St. Albans, Towton, the bloodiest day in English history, and Bosworth, where Richard III famously lost his crown and his life to Henry Tudor, ending the Plantagenet rule and starting the Tudor dynasty. But the family were more than just their civil wars. They were a complicated bunch with a knack for political maneuvering, backstabbing, and dramatic public displays. They built some of England's most famous castles and were responsible for significant legal reforms. But Let's be honest, they're mainly remembered for their spectacular fallouts and the way they turned sibling rivalry into a national sport. Their legacy is a story of power, betrayal, and the high cost of the throne, painting a vivid picture of medieval monarchy in all of its brutal glory. Next, we are talking about the Tarverdieva family. In Stavropol, Russia, there was a family that turned their lives into a real-life horror movie. Meet the Tarverdieva family, led by Inessa and her husband Roman, along with their daughters Victoria and Anastasia. This family wasn't just your average family next door. Over 6 years, starting as early as 2007, they embarked on a terrifying crime spree across the region. Inessa, a former nursery school teacher, and Roman, a dentist, led their family into a very dark world of crime, robbing, and eliminating anyone who got in their way. The family's method was chilling. They used camping trips as a cover to scout for their next victims, ranging from police officers to innocent travelers. Their most notorious crime was the brutal attack on the Chudakov family, where they mercilessly ended the lives of the family, taking trivial items while leaving more valuable assets untouched. This family of serial killers showcased a bizarre mix of domestic life and ruthless criminal activity, making them one of the most disturbing families in recent history. Their reign of terror ended in 2013 when they were finally captured, revealing a cache of weapons and stolen goods. Next, we are talking about the Kelly family. Back in 1887, the Kelly family ran a seemingly innocent inn in Kansas, a place that promised rest for cattle ranchers and travelers trekking across the dusty plains. Led by William Kelly along with his wife Kate, their son Bill, and daughter Kit, this family wasn't just serving up hospitality. They had a very sinister side that turned their homely inn into a deadly trap. The Kellys had a gruesome setup, a chair positioned over a trapdoor at their dining table. Unsuspecting guests who sat there would plummet through the floor, often to their deaths. If the fall didn't do the trick, members of the Kelly family would descend into the darkness to finish the job. But like all dark secrets, this one didn't stay hidden forever. After several travelers failed to reach their destinations, whispers and suspicions grew. When the Kelly family suddenly fled towards Mexico, the local authorities inspected the inn. What they found was the stuff of nightmares. Numerous bodies hidden beneath the house, in the stable, and near the barn, revealing the true horror of what went on at the inn. Legend has it that a furious posse caught up with the Kellys, and in a swift, brutal act of frontier justice, the family finally met their end. Next, we are talking about the Staffelback family. In the rugged and wild heartland of Kansas, there once lurked a family that could give any horror movie a run for its money. Led by the matriarch Nancy Staffelback, this family wasn't just running a brothel, they were running a death trap. The nightmare is believed to have started when her sons, Ed and Mike, lost control and, in a violent fit of rage, took the lives of two women who were living at their brothel. But they didn't stop there. The Staffelbacks turned their establishment into a macabre business, robbing and taking the lives of many of the unsuspecting souls who wandered in looking for some company. While the law only managed to pin one crime against a miner whose body was unceremoniously dumped in a mine shaft on the family, whispers and rumors suggested that the Staffelbacks might have been responsible for up to 50 deaths. The true extent of their gruesome spree remains buried in history, but the chilling legacy of Nancy and her sons serve as a dark reminder of the evil that can fester behind closed doors, turning a simple house into a den of death and despair. Next, we are talking about the Murdaugh family. A long-standing pillar of South Carolina's legal scene, this family turned from being revered into reviled as their saga unfolded like a southern Gothic tale dripping with scandal and tragedy. Starting in the 18th century, the Murdaughs were a force in the Low Country, dominating the judiciary for nearly a century. 3 generations of Randolph Murdaughs consecutively held the post of circuit solicitor from 1920 to 2006, earning the 5-county area the name Murdaugh Country. Yeah. The family's law firm, founded in 1910 by Randolph Murdaugh Sr., thrived on personal injury litigation. However, beneath the surface of legal triumphs lay a murky world of crime and corruption. Richard Alex Murdaugh, along with various family members, became embroiled in a web of killing, fraud, theft, and witness intimidation. The turning point came in 2019 when Alex's son Paul was charged with felony counts related to a fatal boating accident, sparking allegations of preferential treatment. The dark underbelly of the Murdaugh dynasty was fully exposed in June 2021 when Alex's wife Maggie and son Paul were found with their lives taken at their estate. Alex was later charged with the crime, and in 2023 he was found guilty, receiving 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. This high-profile case, covered extensively by media, including an entire Netflix series, peeled back layers of a family that wielded enormous power, only to be undone by their own grievous misdeeds. From legal luminaries to convicted felons, the Murdaughs' story is a dramatic fall from grace, marked by a tragic blend of power, deception, and violence that turned Murdaugh country into a land of infamy. Next, we are talking about Gerald and Charlene Gallego. Between 1978 and 1980, Sacramento, California was the hunting ground for a notorious couple who embarked on a terrifying crime spree, leaving a trail of horror behind them. Gerald and Charlene were a deadly duo who kidnapped women, turning them into their captives and subjecting them to unspeakable horrors before brutally ending their lives. In total, they claimed 10 innocent lives. Their reign of terror came to an abrupt end after a particularly bold kidnapping of Craig Miller and Mary Elizabeth Sowers, witnessed by the victim's friend, who quickly noted the van's license plate. Despite this, the evil couple managed to take the lives of Craig and Mary before the police could catch up. Gerald was sentenced to death in both California and Nevada, symbolizing the gravity of his crimes, while Charlene, turned informant, received a comparatively lenient 16-year sentence, walking free in 1997. Gerald's life ended in prison due to rectal cancer in 2002, but the dark shadow of their deeds lingers in the memory of Sacramento to this day. Next, we are talking about David Allen Gore and Fred Waterfield. In the early 1980s, this duo, known as the Killing Cousins, unleashed a horrifying spree of violence against women. These 2 cousins were not just family, they were partners in a chilling series of gruesome crimes. They attacked their victims, dismembering their bodies and hiding them in unmarked graves. Gore, the more outspoken of the 2, was found guilty of taking the lives of 6 women and definitely didn't hesitate to drag Waterfield into the nightmare, claiming he was involved in every attack. Despite this, Waterfield played the innocence card, bizarrely claiming that he was just a hostage in the whole situation. But the evidence, of course, stacked up against him, and while Gore faced execution in 2013, 30 years after their brutal crimes, Waterfield ended up with a life sentence behind bars. Next, we are talking about Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bueno Jr. Known as the Hillside Stranglers, these cousins were a chilling example of family ties turned toxic. These 2 turned the hills of Los Angeles into a nightmare landscape between 1977 and 1978, where they went on a crime spree that ended in taking the lives of 10 young women. What's particularly twisted is how they operated under the guise of police officers to lure their victims, showing a creepy level of cunning and manipulation. Their crimes, which originally threw investigators off by making them think a single person was behind them, revealed the dark potential of what can happen when family bonds are combined with a shared psychopathic streak. After their spree, the gruesome discoveries of the victims' bodies on the hillside sent shockwaves through the city, marking them as one of the most notorious pairs in American crime history. Bianchi tried to play the insanity card, but eventually both he and Buono were caught and convicted, proving that even the closest finest of family can't escape the long arm of the law when they spiral into such deep evil. Next, we are talking about the Fox sisters. These were 3 siblings from Rochester, New York, who sparked the entire spiritualism movement in the 19th century. Initially, young sisters Kate and Margaret Fox fooled people into believing that they could communicate with spirits using mysterious rappings. Their older sister Leah saw an opportunity and managed their careers, turning them into famous mediums. For years, they convinced many that they were channeling the dead, influencing a wave of spiritual belief across America. However, the spooky tale took a twist in 1888 when Margaret publicly admitted that it was all a hoax. She showed that the eerie sounds were actually made by just cracking their toe joints. Despite their confession, the fascination with spiritualism didn't die down. It actually continued to grow, showing just how eager people were to believe in the possibility of contacting the afterlife. The story of the Fox sisters is a fascinating mix of deceit, fame, and the human desire to find meaning beyond this world, wrapped up in a legacy that is still debated today. Their journey from small-town tricksters to founders of a major movement shows just how powerful and persuasive a well-spun tale can be, especially when it flirts a little with the unknown. And finally, on our list today, we are talking about the Wildenstein family. Renowned as powerhouse art dealers, the Wildensteins have been at the center of the art world for generations, known for their eye for priceless works and their knack for acquiring them. But it's not just all classy galleries and elegant auctions. This family has found themselves repeatedly in the hot seat for some pretty dodgy behavior. Accusations of fraud, theft, and massive tax evasion have clung to them like paint on a palette. They're like the art world's version of a heist movie, but instead of robbing banks, they're allegedly dodging taxes and swindling heirs out of their rightful inheritances. Their private lives are just as colorful and controversial. There's been messy public divorces that could rival any soap opera, with family members squabbling over their vast fortune. In one particularly juicy episode, a member of the family apparently tried to hide hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art from his estranged wife, leading to a scandal that had everyone from Paris to New York whispering over their champagne glasses. It's like they took the phrase family drama and decided to crank it up to an 11. With the Wildensteins, it's not just about selling art, it's about mastering the art of scandal. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the entrepreneur. Okay, this neighbor story starts out actually quite nice before it takes one of the wildest turns I've ever seen. So basically, the storyteller starts out by explaining that their old neighbor was like the perfect neighbor. They were quiet, they were polite and cordial, and sometimes the two of them would even share a quick chat should they run into each other in the hall. Truly the dream neighbor. The story starts to take a different turn when the storyteller reveals that their nice neighbor is certainly in the business of selling illicit substances, we'll call them. But they also explain that all of his customers were also lovely and were sure to not make too much noise when they were coming by, even if it was late at night or early in the morning. Now, here's where the story takes quite the turn. Turns out that one night, some sort of altercation ensued, and this nice, quiet neighbor ended up taking the lives of 2 people who were at his door. Apparently, it all happened in the hallway, which was quite a gruesome scene afterwards. The storyteller has quite the twist again at the end when they write, quote, "It was crazy. Still, after he got sent to prison, a new guy moved in that played music constantly as loud as he possibly could. I'll take old Stevie back any day." Honestly, I don't agree, but I completely understand. In our number 9 spot today, we have the plot twist. As if that one wasn't enough. Okay, this story is a short one, but man is it effective. They start out by saying, quote, "I used to live in a house that was split into 2 apartments. My neighbor had the lower half, and I learned we had issues with the HVAC when their cigarette smoke came visibly pouring out our registers, stank up everything we owned." Okay, that definitely sucks. I'm sure it's a situation many people have dealt with before, and it would be really frustrating, and honestly, it's hazardous. Surprisingly though, this isn't the worst of it. There's one more sentence to the story, and it somehow still manages to take us on quite a journey. So after they wrote, quote, "stake up everything we owned," they finished with, quote, "then one of them stole my car." Okay, honestly, worse than the smoke, and also I have a million questions about this, starting with how and ending with what happened after. I would love a follow-up on this one. In our number 8 spot today, we have a house's history. So there are places that have certain rules around what a selling agent would have to tell an interested buyer about the history of the house prior to purchasing. Some things are extremely important to some people and not at all to others. I mean, for example, some people don't really mind living in houses that were once the scene of a horrific crime. I personally feel like I wouldn't exactly be comfortable with that. Some things in some areas, however, don't have such widespread rules when it comes to these things, which means that sometimes new homeowners are in for quite a surprise, just like these ones. This story starts off, quote, "When we moved in, he," meaning the neighbor, "came over to tell us the house had previously burned down twice. News to us." Okay, that's interesting, but not too scary yet, but they continue on to say, quote, "Got the feeling he wanted to sort of brag about how he saved people from the fires. Then a few years later, after leaving our garage door open, we found our stored grill with all the unlit burners on and a bit of burnt paper sitting underneath. He's since disappeared, but we lock up our propane now." What in the world? How terrifying! The man disappeared? This is why I Google everything first. From places to people, I scour the internet prior because you never know, people are strange. In our number 7 spot today, we have the backdoor neighbor. This story starts off when a couple moved into a new house in the summer of 2019. Upon moving in, both of the neighbors on either side warned this couple about the neighbor who lived behind them, as they had been known to cause quite a bit of trouble. The first 6 months were fine, but things quickly took a turn. They go on to explain that, quote, "Their house sits on a hill behind ours, and so it overlooks the majority of our backyard due to the elevation change. Well, one night, morning technically, at about 3 a.m. we wake up to ring notifications from our phones showing video from our front doorbell. There's a man standing barefoot in a sleeveless shirt on our porch pounding on our front door. We give it 2 to 3 minutes just watching him on the app, thinking maybe he's drunk and has the wrong house, essentially giving him the benefit of the doubt. At this point, the guy at the door starts to yell, he's cursing, he's saying that he's gonna fight them, and then he leaves the front to head around the side of the house towards the backyard. They still have no idea who this is, so they of course call the police. Before the police arrive, the neighbor behind them turns on a huge spotlight that's shining into the storyteller's backyard, and they're thinking, okay, our neighbors, they know something's going on and they gave us some light to like check it all out or whatever. Turns out, not the case at all. Once the police arrive, it becomes clear that the spotlight neighbor is the one who was pounding on the door, and here's the reason. The neighbor said to the police when they showed up that he was angry because a few nights prior, in the middle of the night, the storyteller let his dog out in his own backyard, but that when he did it, he was in his boxers, and the neighbor was claiming that he did it on purpose to make him uncomfortable since their yard looks down on the storytellers and they could see everything. They then write, quote, "He then followed this up to the police with evidence, which consisted of videos he had taken through our windows of my wife and I inside our own home doing totally normal things like chores, watching TV, etc. Nothing inappropriate or scandalous, not that it would have mattered anyway, we were in our own home." This story truly is next level. In the end, the police clearly understood that there was a breach of privacy, and it is said that the weird neighbors moved out a few months after and the couple celebrated that like it was a holiday. And I do not blame them one little bit. In our number 6 spot today, we have Sebald. Okay, so what happened to friendly neighbors coming over to ask to borrow a cup of sugar? Was that ever how things were, or is that just what movies in Hollywood fed us? It's gotta be made up, right? Or else, how did we get from that to this? This story reads, quote, "A guy named Sebald. He straight up smelled like tuna all the time. He'd come knock on our door to ask for random things in his robe. A rubber band, an apple slicer, a doorstop, like probably once a week. My bedroom door faced his kitchen, and sometimes I'd look over and see him lying on the floor. It was bizarre. Sebald, what in the world is going on? Are you okay? Listen, this isn't the scariest or the worst neighbor. The man just needs some items and likes lying on the floor. I'm certainly not judging, I'm just wondering why. I would have a lot of questions for Sebald if he was my neighbor, but hey, at least he's not out here causing harm. That's definitely more than we can say for some other people on today's list." In our number 5 spot today, we have the early riser. Okay, if anyone has any idea as to what could be going on in this one, please let me know, because from where I'm standing, it just is all extremely weird. This weird neighbor story explains that this specific neighbor loved to get up early. Not like absurdly early, but a solid 6 a.m. wake up every day, which is for sure a commitment. That isn't weird, a lot of people do that, but what a lot of people don't do after their 6 a.m. wake up every day is proceed to go out into the backyard of their home and fight a random mannequin while shouting at the top of their lungs. I guess the whole neighborhood is waking up at 6 a.m. every morning now, too, because this guy's got some steam he needs to release. Honestly, this would be the most annoying thing, but I'd also be very curious and concerned as to what this was all about. In our number 4 spot today, we have Goat Guy. Okay, this is definitely not an inherently terrifying story, but it is so bizarre that it has me just a little on edge. So basically, this short little explanation is, quote, old guy that lived next door when I was young would shower in the backyard, would buy goats to do his lawn. Eventually he stopped buying goats and would just set the lawn on fire. I mean, buying goats to eat your grass so you don't have to cut it is a very expensive method, but a method nonetheless. But setting it on fire? What an absolute hazard to yourself and everyone around you. There's just so much bizarrety going on in this one, I don't even know what to think. In our number 3 spot today, we have Linda Listen. This neighbor story starts off with a storyteller explaining that they have quite a few interesting neighbor stories from this one in particular, named Linda. They go on to write, quote, Linda would often have men outside the apartment building that she locked out screaming her name. But the best story regards a boyfriend Linda had who insisted my roommate and I call him the Captain. About a week after meeting him, we came home to a wedding announcement for Linda and the Captain. Yes, his name was the Captain on the announcement. Exactly 1 week later still, the Captain was arrested outside of our apartment building for public intoxication at 2 a.m. while screaming, I've made a huge mistake, F you Linda, a huge mistake, I'm ruined. It seems as though this guy was no longer the Captain. I have no idea what happened here or what led to this demise, but I mean, I can't exactly say I'm surprised. In our number 2 spot today, we have Cat Lady. This story is from someone named Kate, and she starts off explaining that she had a cat named Donovan, and her strange neighbor was named Susan. Susan was single, in her 50s, seemed nice, and had a lovely garden. Kate then goes on to write, quote, one summer we were going on vacation for a week. We asked if she could look after the cat while we were gone. She enthusiastically said yes and offered to have our cat stay at her house so it wouldn't get bored or lonely. How sweet of her. Kate then explains that they go away on vacation, everything's great, but when they came back and Kate's mom went to pick up the cat, things went awry. She explains that Susan was weirdly attached to this cat after 1 week, so much so that she was full on weeping when she was giving the cat back. Kate's mom was weirded out but thanked her, paid her, and then left. Kate then goes on to write that a few days later she woke up early and came to find out that Susan had walked the entire acre that separated their houses in order to try and look for Donovan. She was saying that she just needed to see her baby. Kate says that it was weird, but they let it go this time. But then she writes, quote, then one day we had let our cat out for a while, it was an indoor-outdoor cat, and when we called him to come in, he didn't come. We checked all the places he usually lounged and he was nowhere to be found. We searched for hours. Finally, after a day of searching, my dad said, oh my god, Susan. Could she? My parents quickly went over there to ask if she had seen the cat, and Susan vehemently denied knowing anything about where the cat was. She was visibly angry about being asked and then offered up, what do you think, that I stole him? Then my mom started calling his name and whistling for him, and before Susan could get the door slammed, he strolled to the door from somewhere inside the house and greeted my mom with a meow. My mom was pissed. She started yelling about if you ever steal our cat again and I ought to call the police, and left. He was an indoor cat for the next few months until we moved again. Honestly, could you imagine your neighbor stealing your animal? I would have absolutely lost my mind. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Flyers. So this story starts out with a storyteller explaining to us that he lives in a fourplex that is mostly elderly people living in it, and that there was another fourplex across from them, and that was basically the situation for the entire block. So one night, when our storyteller is going out with some friends, as they are leaving his place, a neighbor of his comes out and a very hateful altercation ensues. The neighbor man yells some horrible things, the storyteller yells some things back, and that's when the neighbor makes some very serious threats, and then the storyteller just carries on with heading out for the night. Then he goes on to write, quote, "Well, when I got home, he had super glued my screen door completely shut, poured hamburger helper or something similar into my AC unit, scratched up my very expensive and still quite new Lexus SUV." This isn't where it ends though. They then take photos from the storyteller's Facebook and use them to spread a horrible, dangerous rumor about the storyteller. The insane neighbor used these photos to make posters and flyers spreading this rumor, and then on the back of them, quote, "He stated where I worked, what time I left, what time I arrived, when I took lunch, and where I went on the weekends. It was very unusual. I ended up having to take him to court, file a restraining order against him after he showed up to my job, threatened to burn down my building, which I finally had enough and went outside to fight him. Luckily, my employees already had him cornered out in the parking lot. Thank God for restraining orders." You guys, this one is probably the most insane we have on this list. That's just next level and also very dangerous. I'm just glad the storyteller made it through this entire ordeal, and I hope that they were awarded with great neighbors from then on. Starting off our list in our number 10 spot, we have impeccable timing. Okay. This story is one that has quite the plot twist that I absolutely was not expecting. It reads, quote, "There is this one guy in my neighborhood. We seem to operate on the same schedule since we see each other at the bus stop almost every day. We never talk much, he always just asks me for a cigarette and I usually give him one. The problem is that I don't have a sensible schedule. My classes are at a different time every day and get rescheduled more often than not, and I make my own work hours, so I just come in whenever. Last time I saw him was a couple of hours ago. I'm walking home, middle of the night, and some guy jumps me from the back saying, 'Do you have a cigarette?' I turn around and it's the same guy just strolling around the neighborhood at 2:30 a.m. looking for somebody to lend him a smoke. My instincts are telling me that something is seriously wrong here, but what do you guys think? I don't feel like this is just a strange coincidence." In our number 9 spot today, we have The Agent. This neighbor story comes from someone who lived in an apartment building and who had one neighbor who was exceptionally nosy and suspicious of others in the building. So much so that she decided to do something absolutely insane, which was to stage phone calls with FBI headquarters about other tenants in the building and what she called alarming behavior. This behavior she's referencing would have to be something super outlandish and crazy for her to go to those lengths, right? Oh no, we're talking like people coming home after 9 p.m. and she's like, better call the FBI. The story then continues on to say that she even went as far as to post a fake government notice on the walls of the building. This lady just will not quit. So, guess what made this lady stop all of her nonsense? Well, the storyteller decided to take a page out of her book and they staged a fake phone call. This time, they just loudly chatted about the illegalities of everything that this lady was doing, including her impersonation of an FBI agent. Who would have guessed? Shortly after this staged call, the neighbor lady stopped. In our number 8 spot today, we have Peeping Tom. Okay, so this one is truly one of the creepiest things I have ever heard. This story comes from a man who lives with his wife, and they have a downstairs neighbor who is certainly something else. First, this neighbor approaches the wife and says to her that he can hear her and her husband all the time, with a super creepy and sinister grin on his face, which is already absolutely horrifying to even think of. This is already enough to just give you the heebie-jeebies, but this story unfortunately gets worse. One day the wife was painting the porch of the house and accidentally dropped a paintbrush. She bent down to pick it up, and this is when she had to see what no one should have to see. Through the slits in the deck, she saw this creepy neighbor's eyes staring up at her. Tell me why this guy was just laying under the porch staring up at her, being a weirdo Peeping Tom while she painted the porch. They have no idea how long he was there for, and honestly, they probably don't even want to know. In our number 7 spot today, we have The Next Door Dentist. This story comes from someone whose neighbor was a dentist and he lived with his wife, and they apparently had one kinda creepy child. Our storyteller explains that this weird family next door once absolutely freaked out at them for planting some flowers alongside their fence. They didn't go into detail about why, but the dentist's family screamed as they said they didn't want anyone digging up their land. That's a reasonable request for sure, but also a little suspicious. The dentist's family ended up moving out 2 years after this strange incident, and our storyteller didn't really think of them much until 3 years after that. In an absolutely wild but not surprising turn of events, the dentist dad ended up being arrested for kidnapping his patients. Our storyteller still has never had confirmation, but truly believes that there are still bodies located there on the property. In our number 6 spot today, we have always watching. This story is about the family that lived across the street from our storyteller when they were in high school. Our storyteller would walk to and from school every day, and while the mornings were normal, when he was coming home every day is when things got weird. This family across the street would sit and stare out the window at this guy every single day as he returned from school. I couldn't imagine this happening to me once, let alone every day. That truly sounds like an absolute nightmare. To make things just a little more strange, it apparently wasn't uncommon for them to get phone calls from their scary neighbor's phone number, but when they answered, there just wasn't anyone on the other line. I feel like I would have immediately put my house up for sale or something, because every night I would feel like I need to sleep with one eye open. In our number 5 spot today, we have The Cat Came Back. Okay, last time, on part 1, we had a weird neighbor cat story, and this time we have another one that is arguably weirder and creepier. I'm just saying, if you've got a cat and a strange neighbor, you might want to watch out, because these stories are putting me on edge. This one goes, quote, "There was an old man who lived next door to my last house. I'd wake up every morning to about an hour of 'here kitty kitty kitty.' My cat once went missing for about a week, and he came back with a shaved stomach." Listen, without the whole neighbor part, that story would still be weird and concerning. I'm glad the cat came back, but why in the world was his stomach shaved? Maybe it wasn't the neighbor, I mean there's no proof per se, but man, the whole thing is definitely weird. If it wasn't the neighbor, then what on earth was he up to calling for a cat every morning? I have a lot of questions about this one, and I don't think that any of them are getting answered anytime soon. In our number 4 spot today, we have The Photographer. This strange neighbor story is a very short but exceptionally effective one. The storyteller wrote just, quote, "They sent me pictures of myself mowing the lawn. I had no idea." Imagine getting a photo of yourself that you had no idea someone else took, let alone your neighbor. I feel like I would always feel as if someone's eyes were on me after that. Just full of paranoia to the brim. In our number 3 spot today, we have The Eavesdropper. This neighbor story is about someone who loves to eavesdrop and get involved in things that certainly aren't their business, and they managed to take it way too far. This person wrote, quote, "We had this neighbor that was always in our business. He would tap our phone lines and listen to our problems and then call my grandfather to tell him what was going on with my parents' marriage. We would also find footprints in fresh snowfall walking all around our property and onto our deck. Weird dude." Honestly, I feel like I would be making up some crazy outlandish stories just to test to see if this man really was listening in. I would say that I had like treasure buried in the backyard or something and see if he tried to dig it up. This story certainly is strange, but the storyteller seems fairly casual about the whole experience, so it seems as though it's a story that stuck with them but didn't bother them too much. In our number 2 spot today, we have The Vet Visit. Okay, I don't know what it is with people and pets, but neighbors seriously need to leave other people's alone. This story starts out with a storyteller taking their dog for a pretty regular or standard visit to the vet. While on this visit, however, things start to take a turn when the vet tells them to stop feeding the dog human food. This confused them because they were quite strict about only feeding their dog food. Well, after a little investigation, it turns out that the neighbor this storyteller had, this one who would often call the police about this dog's behavior even though it was a nice, sweet Labrador that showed no aggression at all, yeah, apparently this neighbor had been leaning over the fence to feed the dog food scraps, mop water, and some other harmful things. This one might actually be worse than the neighbors who were stealing the cats. This is truly next level, and I'm glad that the vet was able to catch this and the storyteller could get to the bottom of it all. In our number 1 spot today, we have The Neighbor Across the Hall. Okay guys, this one is definitely the most serious on this list, and it truly is terrifying. Basically, this storyteller's dad lives in an apartment building, and one day he gets a knock on the door and it turns out to be the police. They come in and start asking this man about his neighbor across the hall. They ask him if he's seen anything weird or that sort of thing, but the dad tells them no. He looks well put together, like a businessman, he's around 30, just nothing out of the ordinary, you know, just a regular guy who just lives across the hall. The police then explain that a 30-year-old woman is missing and that she was last seen on security camera footage walking into the building with that guy, but the security camera never captured either of them leaving. In the end, the police get a warrant and they notice a missing shower curtain and that there's golf clubs everywhere, and at this point they place the neighbor under arrest. Sadly, about 3 weeks later, the police found the missing woman, but someone had taken her life. They then go on to write, quote, "Then, about 2 months ago, they found more tapes. As the investigators went back to look at them, they discovered the man leaving the apartment with his golf bag. But, like I said earlier, all of the clubs were in his room. It definitely doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what is going on here at all. I guess this neighbor guy is now saying that it was an accident and he panicked and tried to hide it because he had a girlfriend." At the time the person posted this story, the guy's trial was coming up, and I'm sure it didn't exactly go well for him.